they said, here are your instructions, no footnotes. Don't argue any point. You don't go back and forth. You don't do what academics do. Just say it and they'll believe it. We basically get this third of the angels rebelling before creation from two sources. One is it was imported there in the 19th century to help argue something called the gap theory. The other is writers like Milton, Paradise Lost. Okay, neither of those things is the biblical text. But they were just, again, these are things that get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And they in this case, they actually become in some way doctrine. Human depravity, which began in Genesis 3 at the fall, there's rebellion. It was accelerated and taught to perform better by divine intelligences who wanted to destroy humans. All Genesis commentaries written before 2010 and even after that do not interact with Anas's study are by definition obsolete on this passage. Okay. We're going to talk about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, like it says here, the ancient original context to it. If you want sort of the print version of this, Reversing Hermon is where I spend the most time talking about the ancient Near Eastern background to Genesis 6, 1 through 4. You get some of it in Unseen Realm, naturally, but Reversing Hermon was, I did this book to sort of drill down specifically on Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or as the Book of Enoch would refer to it, the sin of the watchers in 1 Enoch 6 through 16. And the thesis of the book is I want you to know not only what's going on here, but and the ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian background to it, but then how, if you know the background to it, how that material bleeds into the New Testament. So that's what Reversing Hermon is essentially about, the importance of this passage in a number of passages in the New Testament. So we're going to talk about these 4 verses and the 5th verse. That's going to be important, and there's a reason I put it this way. This is probably a familiar passage to most of you. When man, Adam, humankind, began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And it's an odd, strange passage, and probably familiar to most of you here. It's very controversial. Again, this is one of those that, let me put it this way. If you get into sort of an argument with somebody about this, that they're the sons of God are just people, sons of Seth, or kings, or whatever it is, what you have to realize is that the person in front of you is actually suggesting that the ancient Israelites looked at the passage like we do in a modern anti-supernaturalistic post-Enlightenment era. Just think about that. That is not their world. They are just out of the gate predisposed to supernaturalism. We are not, because of the time in which we live. There's a lot of water under the bridge between the Old Testament era and today. And we have had, again, our comfort level with the supernatural has been eroded steadily and consistently because we think somehow that, well, we're moderns and we can dispense with this stuff. But since we're Christians, we sure need this, the virgin birth. we need the hypostatic union, the fact that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. Somehow, this isn't offensive to a rationalist post-Enlightenment worldview. Somehow we retain some respect if we believe this stuff, but we're going to lose all that if we look at Genesis 6 the same way, and other passages. And my answer is, why? I mean, that's the uncomfortable question. Why do you think this is sort of normal and acceptable and the other is not? Frankly, these are more astonishing. Okay, the idea of a Trinity. Like I said a few minutes ago, there's nothing that we believe in the core doctrines of Christianity that is going to be acceptable on a purely rationalistic, materialistic basis. Zero. So you might as well face up to it. Now, I will say it's all defensible in terms of its philosophical, intellectual coherence. All these ideas, beginning with theism, the Genesis 6 stuff is, again, I tend to think of things very simply. All of this stuff extends from the major premise that there is a God. It's theism. If that premise holds, then ideas that extend from it are like these. Well, can God do stuff? Can he create? Well, sure. Does he create with a purpose? Is it possible that he could, endow his supernatural creatures with the ability to take on, human form? Well, again, we know that from passages in the Bible. Is that form physical? I mean, you go down the list of all the things that can God do this, and it's a really short list of the things God can't do. I mean, I try not to put the words can't and God into too many sentences. But again, all of these ideas that, unfortunately, even within the evangelical community, we take the supernatural stuff in the Bible and we say, this is valid and this is invalid. I don't know what gives us the authority to make these two categories, but we do it thinking again that we need to do it to defend ourselves as not crazy people. Okay, nothing we believe that is integral, the concept of sin and the removal of sin, that is inherently, inescapably supernatural. Why is that one acceptable and this isn't? And since the idea of God has been defended philosophically, its coherence has been defended and has held for millennia, it's done really well. Since it holds these other things that derive from it, there's no reason to just dismiss them out of the gate. But again, unfortunately, in our context, that makes a number of people uncomfortable. It made Augustine uncomfortable. And that's really why we sort of have grown up as a church, as big C Christianity, with the Sethite view. Everybody in the Jewish community and the early Christian community, there's one possible exception in a passage in Philo, but all of the texts we have up until just before the time of Augustine with a guy named Scipio Africanus, believed that what's described in Genesis 6, 1-4 was a divine transgression, a supernatural rebellion that impacted humanity, that this is what's being described here. That changes, again, in the 4th century. And because of Augustine's stature, and frankly, he had a problem with the Book of Enoch because of his history with the Manichees. When he became a Christian, he was part of the Manichean sect for a while. And things did not go well. And the Manichees revered the Book of Enoch for different reasons. And so By the time Augustine emerges from that, he has a bone to pick with them and with the Book of Enoch and all this stuff, and he just goes the other direction. And because of the magnitude of his personality, who he was as a theologian, basically the rest of the church followed suit. And Augustine has that kind of weight in other areas too. But this, again, is part of that, and so we call, as I say in Unseen Realm, we call out hermeneutical SWAT teams to make passages like this not say what they say, while we keep stuff like the Trinity and the virgin birth. It's very inconsistent. I understand why we do that, but it's very inconsistent. Now, Peter and Jude, I think, is typically the place to start. We're not going to go through all the ins and outs of the Sethite view, but Peter and Jude clearly did not view the sons of God in this incident as mere humans. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, this is going to be, we're going to come back to this. The word there is sent them to Tartarus. Tartarao is the verb. And committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept with until judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world via God. I mean, it's clear, the context is clearly the flood. He refers to them as angels that sinned. Why isn't that clear? Well, it's not clear because people don't want it to be clear, and then again, you call out the hermeneutical SWAT team to make it say something other than what it actually says. There are real problems with that. There's no other candidate for angels that sinned. Now, some people will reflexively go, well, what about the third of the angels rebelling, before humans were created and the fall of Lucifer and stuff like that? So you try not to be shocked here, but there isn't a single verse in the Bible that describes a rebellion of a third of the angels before the creation of humanity. 0. The only place, in fact, that you get the word third with the word angel is Revelation 12, which is the last book of the Bible. And the reference is to again, pardon the pun, the fallout of the birth of the Messiah. That's what you've got. Now, we basically get this third of the angels rebelling before creation from 2 sources. One is it was imported there in the 19th century to help argue something called the gap theory. The other is writers like Milton, Paradise Lost. Okay, neither of those things is the biblical text. But they were just, again, these are things that get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And they in this case, they actually become in some way doctrine. That does happen with a few subjects. But if you actually go with the biblical text, and of course, one that's associated with the flood, you don't really have any ammunition there. So it's kind of obvious that the casting into hell, chains of gloomy darkness, you'll notice these descriptions, you're not going to find the casting anyway, and you're not going to find a specific reference to chains in the Old Testament, either in Genesis 6 or elsewhere. So Peter is drawing on something else. Now we're going to find out that the something else happens to be the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Enoch, though, draws on a Mesopotamian story that really was the background to Genesis 6. You realize that Enoch and other Dead Sea Scrolls, like guys like Gilgamesh actually appear by name in those texts. Whoever's writing that material has a very strong acquaintance with Mesopotamian material. And it's going to come out in what's called the story of the Apkallu, which is the Mesopotamian backstory to why we even have Genesis 6, 1 through 4 in the Bible. Peter and Jude aren't going back and reading cuneiform. They don't need to, because that material has been preserved in books like Enoch. And so this is where they're getting it. Jude 6 and 7, the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in, there's the chains again, there's the gloomy darkness again, until the judgment of the great day. Then he mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens before Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical story? Well, it's the story of the flood. So here we go again, the angels that sin. And again, any commentator, any academic commentator will tell you that there's a strong relationship between 2 Peter and Jude, in terms of its content and all that kind of stuff, and its vocabulary. Again, it's set in a sexual context, and likewise indulged in sexual immorality. And again, there's really no other possible reference than Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And Peter and Jude aren't afraid of that. It doesn't bother them. Bothers a lot of people now, but it doesn't bother them. Kept in chains under gloomy darkness. Again, that really points to the original context, as we will see. So the real death blow to the Sethite view is this question: are you going to interpret Scripture against its original context or not? And I have said on my blog that I've referenced, I'll just spell it out for you. If you want to go look for this will be the easy way to find it. Go to Google, put in my website, drmsh.com, and then put in the author's last name, Annus, A-N-N-U-S. Amar Annus is his full name. He's a cuneiform scholar in Helsinki. And then Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and you will find his article. He wrote an article in 2010 that is just really of fundamental importance. The article is called On the Origin of the Watchers. And he traces, because this is his field, he's a Mesopotamian guy, he traces Enoch's Watcher story back on many levels and in many layers back into the Mesopotamian stuff. And in so doing, he provides, again, from the Old Testament world, the context of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. He shows you what Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is shooting at. And he also does something that is really important. Have you ever read Genesis 6, 5? Okay, that's the verse about, that God, saw the wickedness of man, that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Well, what does that have to do with the first 4 verses? Have you ever wondered that? Like, why did we get to that verse? How do we get from Genesis 6, 1 through 4 to that? If you know the backstory, you have the answer to that, or I'm going to show you that today. It's completely consistent and coherent. It's just that the writer of Genesis 6 assumes that you know the context because he's writing to people in his world, not ours. Yes, ma'am. drmsh.com, that's my homepage. And the last name of the guy is A-N-N-U-S. And you could put in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It's going to be the top, first or second hit in the Google results. But you can download his article there. Now, let's go back to Peter. This cast them into hell, tartarao is the Greek verb, cast them into Tartarus. This is another important clue. Tartarus was the place in the Greek Titan story where the Titans, who are rebellious gods, they're not people, folks, they're rebellious gods, they were cast for their transgression. Again, it's a clear, if you're using this verb in this place, it's a clear, unmistakable reference to a divine rebellion. That's all it can be. So again, do you want to interpret the passage in light of its own context or what context that you give it so that it's more comfortable? That's the question. So 2 Peter and Jude refer to the rebellious sons of God being imprisoned in darkness. Now, where does all this stuff come from? Again, the short answer is Peter and Jude are dipping into Enoch and other Second Temple texts. Jubilees has this stuff in it, the Book of the Giants from Qumran. The Book of the Giants is a fragmentary text. I don't know anywhere, like on the internet, where the English translation is published. There is a complete, very thorough, even mind-numbingly thorough, scholarly edition of the Book of Giants from Qumran by Lawrence Stuckenbrook, which is really good. And we have it in Logos, by the way, so you can actually just read the translation there. But I'm just not sure where you could find that. And again, most of it's fragmentary anyway. There's just sections of it. But this is the material, again, that the New Testament writers had access to, and they're reading this stuff because it's part of what their community is producing, talking about the Bible. It's like if I read a commentary on a biblical book, or you read, some book about a biblical topic. This is what they're doing. They're not doing anything different than what we do. They read books. And some of those books help them process information and become very useful when they try to articulate a thought in their own writings. It's just the most normal thing in the world. This is how people do research and how they think about things and then how they write things. Right? So in 1 Enoch, the sons of God are known as watchers. That's the major term. And it's a biblical term as well. It occurs 4 times in the Old Testament, all of them in Daniel 4. And it's a neutral term in Daniel 4. I guess I could say a positive one. Just don't conclude, at least in Daniel 4, that watchers are bad guys. They're not. In Second Temple literature, they are, because everybody's talking about Genesis 6. So they're bad guys there. They descend to, on or to Mount Hermon, and they make a vow to corrupt humanity. Again, their sin isn't just the transgression with daughters of men. There's something worse in the Jewish mind. And Enoch says, and this will be, again, important for the connection to the Messiah, that the sons of God taught humans certain points of knowledge that led to self-destruction and idolatry. So, in other words, what this is really saying is, look, human depravity, which began in Genesis 3 at the fall, there's rebellion, it was accelerated and taught to perform better by divine intelligences who wanted to destroy humans. That's the thought, that there are oppositional supernatural intelligences, both then and of course now, that love to have people, love to help people, love to play on our propensities and our depravities and our proclivities, our sinful impulses, our desire for autonomy from authority. They love to help that along so that we can more effectively destroy ourselves and the people around us. And the bonus is we can become idolaters. We worship other gods, or no God at all. We worship ourselves. This was the big concern in Second Temple literature. It wasn't the Nephilim, because according to the biblical text, the Nephilim lines are wiped out during the time of David, who, by the way, is the archetype for the Messiah. That might be important. Okay. That's when that ends, but this problem persists. It's a big issue. Here are some of the things, again, that they taught. There's astrology, technology for warfare, helps to kill more people effectively. Roots and spells, the drugs, the cosmetics, which sounds odd, but the point is, again, seduction, immorality outside the boundaries of marriage and all that kind of stuff, just sexual indulgence. So this is the backdrop, actually, for Genesis 6:5. So the reason we have verse 5 is because if you know the rest of the story in Genesis 6:1-4, it's not just the Nephilim. If you know that the story is also responding to something about supernatural intelligences corrupting humans from within, if you know that, Genesis 6:5 makes perfect sense. Because the effect of all this is that every thought of the imagination of their hearts was only evil continually. Now, Peter and Jude know this because they do know the backstory. And the backstory extends again from Second Temple literature, which draws on earlier Mesopotamian stuff. And that's what we want to get into. So here's the verse 5. And have you ever wondered, again, how this follows? Enoch preserves why. Again, we have a fall, but we have the problem of depravity that is related to this incident. Now, it seems contrived, but where does Enoch get this stuff? And here we go with Mesopotamia. There's a Mesopotamian backstory to Genesis 6:1-4, the depravity of Genesis 6:5. And this is where Anas's article that I just gave you the reference to, this is where he lives. He is the guy who, again, It was a simple thing. He's like, it's been a while since a cuneiform person, a scholar, looked at all that flood stuff specifically with an eye toward the first 4 verses of Genesis 6, not the flood. I mean, everybody does that. Okay, connections between Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical flood story. I mean, they've been doing that since the late 1800s, okay? But what about the first 4 verses? I'm going to go back and look at the cuneiform material and just see, what's there. And his article tells you what's there. Every element is there. Again, there's Onas's article. The story is the story of a group called the Apkallu. And it establishes the concept. And by the way, since it was Onas who deserves credit for ferreting this stuff out, and his material was published in 2010, I've said this on my blog and I'll say it here. All Genesis commentaries written before 2010 and even after that do not interact with Onas's study are by definition obsolete on this passage. You either interact with the material or you don't. And, it's only been 2010 that somebody did the grunt work to do this. So, we can give a pass to older commentators, but you can't give a pass now because the job of scholars is supposed to be to keep up with this stuff. So if you're not doing it, you're either negligent or you don't want your readers to see it. You got 1 of 2 choices and neither of them are very good. It's either incompetence or malice. I take your pick. Right? Now, the Apkallu, again, are divine beings. And so there's really no doubt that the sons of God are going to be divine beings. So here we go. This is the entry from DDD, which was actually published before 2010, but it's nowhere near as detailed as Onas. This entry describes the Apkallu as the culture heroes from before the flood in Mesopotamian thinking. Now that term culture heroes means this. The Mesopotamians believed that the Apkallu were these supernatural beings that deserved credit for helping the Mesopotamians to develop their civilization. They gave them knowledge to become great. Okay, that's what a culture hero is in academia. See, I'm the academese translator here. They're the culture heroes from before the flood in the service of Ea, a variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian, that means before the flood. A variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian period were supposedly passed on by the Apkallu. And this is Mesopotamian theology, if you will. They're referred to as 7 sages. They were created in the river. The Akkadian term is actually the Abzu, the abyss. That might become important later on. That's where they're created. And they served as those who ensured the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. In other words, they were pretty smart. They knew lots of stuff. Following the example of Ea, who is the god of wisdom in the Mesopotamian pantheon, they taught mankind wisdom, social forms, craftsmanship, basically what you need to have a civilization. So in Mesopotamian thinking, these are good guys. These are wonderful guys. I mean, they helped us become as great as we are. The gods gave us our civilization, in effect. The Apkallu then were the wise divine beings from the watery abyss, the underworld, the place opposite the heavens. In Mesopotamian religion, they were responsible for maintaining the correct balance between heaven and earth. That was the will of the greater gods, which of course sets the stage for, well, what if they do something that puts it out of balance? The Apkallu possessed knowledge from the divine world that made heaven and earth tick. Before the flood, they gave knowledge to humans to civilize them. Now, this was important to the scribes of Babylon living after the flood because the scribes were the ones who inherited this stuff. And so the question naturally arose, well, where did you get it? where did you get, and the scribe said, well, we got it from the Apkallu. And people would say, well, no, wait a minute. There was a flood, and like, how did that work? So they're asking the same question in Mesopotamia. It's really interesting as a little bit of sidebar. If you actually go to the Mesopotamian text, and Annas does a nice job of this, and you look at the specifics of what Enoch says the Watchers taught, and then you look at the areas of expertise of the Apkallu, guess what? They align. What a coincidence.